Sometime in early 1964, a completed Winchester Model 94 carbine came off the production floor in New Haven, Connecticut, and into the hands of a man who had been building these rifles long enough to know what they felt like. The action felt different. The cartridge lifter, which on every previous rifle had been machined from solid steel, was now stamped from sheet metal. The receiver, which every Model 94 since 1894 had been built from forged and milled steel, was now sintered iron, a material that could be pressed into shape from powder without the slow, expensive work of machining a solid billet. The rifle functioned. The endurance tests had confirmed that. The engineers who designed the changes had certified that nothing essential to the gun's operation had been compromised by any of the 27 modifications that together cut the manufacturing cost of a Model 94 by 54%. The rifle was the same rifle, numerically. It was a different object in the hand. The man who had built the old one knew it without being told. That moment on the production floor in early 1964 is where the story of the Model 94 ends, though the rifle itself would continue for another 42 years and several million additional units. Everything before that moment was the accumulation of an asset. Everything after was the spending of it. The asset was not the mechanism, which worked. The asset was the reputation that the mechanism had earned by working perfectly, from forged steel, fitted by hand, for 70 years without an interruption in quality. You can spend a reputation that took 70 years to build a good deal faster than 70 years. Winchester would spend the next 42 proving how much faster. You need to understand what John Moses Browning did in the summer of 1894 before you can understand what Winchester lost in the winter of 1964. Browning came to Winchester's New Haven factory to present a lever-action design he had been developing since the late 1880s. The design addressed a problem that every rifle maker in America had been trying to solve: how to chamber a lever action for the new smokeless powder cartridges that were just then coming out of military ordnance labs, which operated at pressures high enough to destroy the toggle link actions that the Winchester models of 1866, 73, and 76 all used. Browning's solution was a single rear locking bolt that could handle higher chamber pressures than the old toggle links, in a receiver that was still slim enough for a man to carry all day. Winchester's president, Thomas Bennett, paid Browning $15,000 for the design, the same flat fee he had paid for earlier Browning designs. No royalties. Browning went back to Ogden, Utah. Winchester went to work. The first Model 1894 rifles came out of the New Haven plant in the fall of that year, chambered in 3240 and 3855, both black powder rounds. In 1895, Winchester changed the alloy composition of the barrel and receiver steel to handle higher pressures and introduced two smokeless powder chamberings: the 2535 and the 30 Winchester center fire, which would eventually become known as the 3030 after Marlin, not wanting to advertise its competitor's cartridge, used the older black powder nomenclature on its version of the same loading. The 3030 was the first smokeless powder cartridge commercially available to the American civilian market. The rifle that introduced it became the rifle that introduced smokeless powder to every American hunter who could not afford a custom rifle. That was most American hunters. The Model 94 and the 3030 were not separate products in the market. They were each other's reason for existing, and they spread together across every deer camp and ranch and farm toolshed in America. A deer hunter in Michigan or Pennsylvania or Ohio or Texas in 1910 was working country that did not require the range or velocity of the military cartridges that were being developed in ordnance laboratories at the same time. The country he was hunting in was second-growth timber and river bottom and cedar swamps, none of it more than 150 yards across an opening, and most of it less than 100. What he needed was a rifle that was light enough to carry all day, short enough to swing through timber, fast enough for a second shot, and reliable enough that it would not jam on the first morning of the season with a buck standing 30 yards away. The Model 94 in 3030 was all of those things and cost less than almost any other centerfire rifle on the market. He saved for it, he bought it, he used it for the next 30 years. When his son started hunting, there was no conversation about what rifle the boy would start with. The Model 94 was the answer before the question was finished. The dealer in town, who sold sporting goods, stocked it as a matter of course because every man who came in needing a deer rifle ended up buying one. The cartridge was available in every hardware store that stocked ammunition. The gun needed no explanation. A generation of American hunters grew up with one in the house, the way earlier generations grew up with a saddle, and the gun passed from father to son with the same practical understanding that a saddle passes. This is what the work requires, and this is what has always worked, and there is no reason to change it. Winchester presented the millionth Model 94 to President Calvin Coolidge in 1927. The rifle was engraved and checkered and gold-plated in the way that presentation rifles are, and it was the millionth production unit of a design that had been in continuous production for 33 years. The company understood what it had. The second million went to President Harry Truman in 1948. The third million mark was reached in 1967, 3 years after the changes that were already hollowing out the asset began. Winchester either did not understand that or did not care. The evidence suggests the latter. The changes that went into effect in 1964 had been in engineering review since 1961. A Remington engineer named Bill Miller later wrote in the American Rifleman that the Model 94 had become the first Winchester product to go through a full re-engineering program using the latest manufacturing technology. 27 separate modifications were approved and implemented. The forged and milled steel receiver, which had been the foundation of every Model 94 since 1894, was replaced with a receiver made from sintered iron in a process similar to investment casting, pressing the material from powder rather than shaping it from a solid billet. The cartridge lifter, machined from solid steel on every pre-1964 rifle, was replaced with a stamped sheet metal part. Hollow roll pins replaced the solid steel pins in the action. The cost per unit dropped by 54%. The rifle came off the line and felt wrong in the hand, and every gunsmith and hunter and collector who had ever held the old one knew it within the first few seconds. The immediate market reaction was not catastrophic. The rifle still sold. The 3030 still sold. Most buyers who walked into a hardware store in the 1960s to buy a deer rifle were not collectors. They were hunters who wanted a reliable lever action at a price they could afford, and the Model 94, in either form, was still that rifle. But the community of serious buyers, the men who knew the rifle from repeated use and who understood what forged steel and fitted parts felt like compared to what sintered castings and stampings felt like, understood that Winchester had decided its most valuable asset was a cost problem rather than a capital account. They began marking the pre-64 Model 94s as the genuine article and everything after as the discounted version. That distinction has never gone away. A pre-64 Model 94 commands a premium on the collector market to this day that a post-64 rifle of identical mechanical function cannot approach. The labor picture in New Haven was deteriorating at the same time. The plant had employed between 15,000 and 20,000 workers during the Second World War, when Winchester was producing rifles, carbines, and machine guns for Allied forces across 3 shifts around the clock. By 1955, when the International Association of Machinists, Local 609, organized the floor, the workforce was down from wartime peaks, but still a significant employer in the city. Strikes hit in 1962, 1969, and then the long one of 1979 that lasted into 1980 and cut the workforce from 2,300 to 800. Each strike made the cost of building a rifle in New Haven higher and the argument for building it somewhere else easier to make. By the time Olin Corporation sold the plant to its own employees in December of 1980, the decision about New Haven's future had already been made. Olin kept the ammunition business. The firearms plant became the United States Repeating Arms Company, a worker-owned firm that licensed the Winchester name from Olin and tried to keep the line alive on its own. United States Repeating Arms filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1989. The plant was acquired by a French holding company, then by FN Herstal of Belgium, the parent company of Browning Arms. The Belgian owners ran the New Haven plant through the 1990s with a workforce that was down to a few hundred from its wartime peaks of 20,000. In 2005, the plant produced 30,517 rifle units, operating at roughly 27% of capacity. On January 16, 2006, FN Herstal's subsidiary United States Repeating Arms Company announced the closure of the New Haven facility. 186 workers, 112 years of continuous production, 6.5 million Model 94s. 14 versions of the rifle were in the catalogue at the time of the announcement. Every last one of them was gone from the Winchester warehouse within 24 hours. Bought up by dealers who understood before the factory doors finished closing that the remaining American-made inventory would never come back. The Winchester name went to Browning and Miroku of Japan, who began producing the Model 94 again in 2010 as a limited commemorative run for the 200th anniversary of Oliver Winchester's birth. The rifle that came out of Miroku's Japanese plant was reviewed as better made than anything New Haven had produced in the final decades of the plant's life. The Japanese factory had the precision equipment and the quality control standards that the aging New Haven complex no longer had. The most successful rifle in American history was being made better, and it was being made in Japan, under license from an Olin Corporation trademark, by a Belgian company's American subsidiary, in a factory built by a Connecticut family that had been selling clothes when it acquired the assets of the Volcanic Repeating Arms Company in 1856 and hired a young designer named Benjamin Tyler Henry who had an idea about how to make a repeating rifle. You already know which side of this you are on. You have always known. When a manufacturer decides that the most successful rifle in American history is a cost problem, it has confused the asset with the liability. The Model 94 was not expensive to build because it was poorly designed. It was expensive to build because it was a forged and fitted and hand-worked mechanism that required skilled craftsmen and the kind of floor time that skilled craftsmen need. The cost of that floor time was the price of the reputation. The reputation was what the buyers were paying for. When Winchester reduced the cost by 54% in 1964, it did not reduce the price by 54%. It reduced the quality by 54% and kept most of the margin. The buyers who noticed paid less for the result from that day forward and more for the original from that day forward. The gun market understood the transaction more clearly than the company did. There is a Model 94 in a wooden gun rack in a farmhouse outside Traverse City, Michigan right now. It was made in 1941. It is chambered in 30-30. The bluing is worn silver at the muzzle and along the top of the receiver where a man's thumb has rested through 60 deer seasons. The lever is worn to a high polish from 100,000 cycles. The stock has a crack at the wrist that was repaired with glue and a screw and is now stronger than the original wood around it. The man who owns it is the third to own it. And he knows from the serial number that it was made in the year the United States entered the Second World War, and that the plant in New Haven was already running war production when this particular carbine came off the line. He has taken deer with it for 41 consecutive seasons. He has never had a malfunction that was not operator error. He has never needed a gunsmith. He has never needed anything except a cleaning rod and a bottle of hoppers and a new box of 30-30 when the old one ran out. That rifle was made by men who learned their trade from men who had been making Model 94s in New Haven since 1894. The knowledge ran unbroken from Browning's $15,000 design in 1894 to the craftsman on the floor in 1941. The roots of that knowledge went back further than 1894, back to the New Haven Arms Company that Oliver Winchester took over in 1857, and the Henry repeating rifle that Benjamin Tyler Henry designed for it in 1860, which Confederate soldiers called the damned Yankee rifle that could be loaded on Sunday and shot all week. Back to the model 1866 that replaced the Henry and the 73 and the 76 and the 86 that Browning designed before the 94. Each design was a generation of knowledge deposited on the floor of that New Haven plant, learned by the men who built it and transferred forward to the men who built the next one. By the time a craftsman in 1941 stood at his station assembling a Model 94, the floor he stood on had 47 years of continuous Model 94 production behind it, and behind that, 85 years of repeating rifle production, going back to a small shop on Orange Street in New Haven, where Oliver Winchester saw a designer named Henry building something nobody else had thought to build. The knowledge ran from Henry to the craftsman of 1964. It ran from the craftsman of 1964 to the engineering report recommending 27 changes and a 54% cost reduction. It did not survive the meeting. The forged receiver was cheaper to produce as sintered iron. The machined lifter was cheaper to produce as sheet metal. The solid pins were cheaper as hollow roll pins. The rifle was cheaper, and cheaper is what the company had decided it needed to be. Two men at a gun show in any Midwestern state today, one of them holding a pre-64 Model 94 and one holding a post-64. One of them is explaining why his rifle is worth 3 times what the other rifle is worth, mechanically and functionally identical, though the action may be. One of them is agreeing that this is true and wishing it were not. Both of them are correct. The gap between the two rifles is not the mechanism. The mechanism works in both cases. The gap is what Winchester decided the mechanism was worth when it decided to build it for 54% less. The official record says 6.5 million rifles, 112 years, New Haven, Connecticut. The last Model 94 came off that floor in March of 2006, carrying serial number 6,580,000 something. A number with no ceremony attached because the plant had been announced closed 2 months earlier, and the ceremony had already happened in the dealers who bought out the warehouse in 24 hours. The actual work behind those 6.5 million rifles says the names of the men on the floor who ran the forging presses and the milling machines and the hand-fitting stations from 1894 to 1964 and built something whose reputation outlasted the factory by 20 years. Their names are not on the receiver. The name on the receiver is the company that decided the receiver was too expensive to make correctly. That name is still worth money on a rifle made in Japan. The reputation that earned the name was built entirely by men whose names are not on it.